Welcome to SAR and to the first event, I believe, that's been air conditioned. We've got air conditioning finally in this room. So we will no longer make you suffer to hear good things. My name is Paul Ryer. I'm the Director of Scholar Programs, and I will moderate today's event. I have a few announcements to start, then I'll introduce our speaker. Our president, Michael Brown, is out of town, so I'm covering. This morning is our last 2019 Summer Salon. These salons are part of our Creative Thought Forum, which is an initiative we started in 2017 to bring innovative thinkers to Santa Fe for lectures, salons, and other programs. Can you hear me? Oh, okay. This year we've been exploring the intersection of tradition and innovation, and starting in the fall we'll transition to our new annual theme with a series of talks exploring the future of work. The first talk will be in October with MIT professor Thomas Malone, whose book Superminds: The Surprising Power of People and Computers Thinking Together was just published this spring. We also have an exciting group of new resident scholars joining us in September, so please be sure to mark your calendars for their talks in the fall. You can find information about our programs on our online calendar, sarweb.org. And thank you to all of our members here. The Creative Thought Forum really is largely funded by our members, and in particular the Founders Society. And with your support, we've been able to put together this great program like the one we're starting now. Let me now introduce our speaker. Bryan Steiff is a Denver, Colorado-based photographer. He completed his BFA in photography at Ohio State University and an MFA in photography from Columbia College, Chicago. During graduate school, he served as the graduate assistant to the department's Visiting Artist program and worked as a curatorial assistant at the Museum of Contemporary Photography. He was adjunct faculty member in the Department of Photography at Columbia College, Chicago from 2004 to 2015, receiving 2 part-time faculty development grants. Steiff was an artist in residence at the University of Chicago Laboratory School during the spring of 2012. Please join me in welcoming Bryan Steiff.
Thank you, Paul. And thank you, Meredith, and everybody at SAR for bringing me in. I'm a pacer when I talk, so I hope this isn't disorienting to anybody. So I'm going to talk about this project that I've been working on for about a decade now, which is sort of been tentatively titled The Wind Project. When the publication comes out, it may end up being titled something else. This project was sparked by a trip to Copenhagen, Denmark in 2009. My wife and I were flying over to visit a friend of mine, and as we were flying into Kastrup Airport in Copenhagen, I saw all these amazing turbines out in the Øresund, the Baltic Sea, between Denmark and Sweden. And there was a little seed that was planted at that point. I had no idea what this was going to turn into, but eventually, 3 years, I took a couple years to start the project, spurred by another encounter with a giant wind farm in Indiana, around Purdue, if you guys are familiar, on I-65. I had driven that route many, many times going home to see my family in Columbus, Ohio. The last time I had driven it, there was nothing but cornfields. And then I drive this road and boom, there's hundreds of turbines everywhere. So that sort of furthered this spark and got me thinking about landscape photography and how we represent the world around us. So I worked on the project starting in 2011. In 2014, we returned to Denmark to celebrate my 40th birthday and to visit with some friends, and so that I could make photographs. So this is actually out in the Baltic Sea. We chartered a small boat to take us out to the wind farm, and just as we left the shore of Denmark, a storm rolled in. Waves that were a little too large for my comfort personally. My wife Sadira was holding on to my belt buckle as I was leaning over the side of the boat, as we were careening on these giant waves. For those of you that make pictures, you know that it's not easy to make a photograph when you're in a moving thing, a moving vehicle. Luckily, eventually the storm kind of mellowed out and I was able to make some pictures, including this one. Now, before I get to my project, I'm going to do a very, very brief synopsis of some landscape history, landscape photography history. If there are any people in the audience know landscape photography and the history of landscape photography, I apologize. This is a very glancing look. But a testament to how important the landscape is in our life and how we think about it. The oldest surviving photograph is in fact a landscape photograph. And this is Joseph Nicephore Niepce, who was instrumental in the development of photography, but unfortunately did not live to really see it come to fruition. So this photo is made in 1826, 1827. Photography was not actually announced until 1839. This is a heliograph, which is made with bitumen of Judea, which is a naturally occurring asphalt. And the sun hardens and darkens this, and then you wash it in lavender oil and mineral spirits, and it washes away all the places that haven't hardened, and you get this. Now, of course, most people know Daguerre, the flamboyant Frenchman who basically took credit for everything without Niepce, and after Niepce died, his son sort of jumped in and helped, but Daguerre really stole the spotlight. So this is one of his first photographs, and this is out the window of his laboratory in the Boulevard du Temple in France, and this will illustrate sort of the changes in technology for you. So at this point, this was high noon. This was a very, very busy, crowded street. But you notice that you don't see anybody, and that's because the exposure times were so long. But you do see right here a man stopped at a shoe shine station. So he was still long enough to capture that. Also coincidentally, a fun point. So Daguerre and Henry Fox Talbot, an Englishman, both announced the invention of photography in January of 1839 simultaneously. The English, Talbot had created what will eventually become the positive-negative system that we all know for photography, as opposed to the daguerreotype, which is a one-of-a-kind unique photo. And the French basically said, here is this invention. We give it to the world to use. It's free for everybody, except the English. They have to pay. And partially in response to their tumultuous history, and partially in response to the English actually charged for Talbot's process instead of giving it freely to the world. So as the technology improves, the speeds of the film become, or not film at this point, the speeds of the light-sensitive material become a little bit faster. We get the development of camera clubs and a lot of Englishmen out in the world making photographs. At this point, they're using the wet collodion process, which is a glass plate with silver and a gelatin coating that you have to coat on the spot, expose, and develop all before it goes totally dry. So it was a very laborious process, and it was a process that required a lot of equipment to carry around. And so at this point, it's really, photography is very much limited to the wealthy. And so you get a lot of wealthy Englishmen traveling the world, making these photographs for people that became known as armchair travelers, because they would experience the world through the photographs of these people that could travel. If we're honest, there's a lot of troubling representations of other cultures that were made during this time period, but generally the landscape is a little bit more straightforward. About the same time, post-Civil War in America, we have a lot of people starting to come out west with the camera. Carlton Watkins is a very famous one of those people. He is pretty much the one that made Yosemite well known. That was his favorite subject. He went into Yosemite with a mammoth plate camera, so an 18 by 22 inch glass plate is what these photographs are made on. So imagine carrying around a box of large glass plates and having to coat these and do all this work before they dried. So these photographs were actually influential in Congress deciding to make Yosemite a national park. Watkins, along with William Henry Jackson, also participated in the numerous geological surveys that were happening during the late 19th century. So this is one of William Henry Jackson's favorite subjects. It's the Mountain of the Holy Cross. And then this is Timothy OSullivan, another basically working in the same vein out west, working on numerous geological surveys. OSullivan was an Irish immigrant who actually cut his teeth during the Civil War. He worked for Matthew Brady, Alexander Gardner, and then eventually after the war, he moved out west and started working with the geological surveys as well. This is Pyramid Lake, just on the border of Nevada and California, if you are familiar. This is also OSullivan, and I put this in here just because I love this. This is his dark room right here. So he had a mule-pulled wagon. He carried all of his supplies, and so he put that in there as a little tribute to his mules and also a point of scale. And then, of course, everybody knows this gentleman here, Ansel Adams. So I've jumped ahead about 50 years. A lot of stuff happened in that 50 years, not necessarily totally pertinent to landscape photography, but we get Ansel Adams, founding member of the Sierra Club, I believe, very, very important in the development of landscape photography. Also really popularized the national parks for a lot of Americans. That was really their first look at the park system. Eliot Porter, he was a Santa Fe resident for the last couple of decades of his life. Porter is really important because this is really the first example that we see of color photography being used in an artful way. At this point, even in the 60s, somebody like Adams was notoriously in love with technology and technological development, but color photography was still sort of a no-go for him, primarily because at this point, color photography was sort of seen as base, not artistic. It was the tool of advertising. So that's the primary reason. Also, at this point, the archival nature was just not there. The chemicals were too unstable in photography, and the processes just were not designed to last a long time. So as we move into the late 60s and late 70s, you get a group of people that become less interested in this sublime nature, this view of beautiful nature, sublime things, and they start to become more interested in how we're shaping our land, how we're building things up. And so these people will be exhibited together in the 1975 exhibition, The New Topographics, at the George Eastman House. If anybody read the handout that I sent, you'll know that this was not a cohesive movement of people. This was several people working independently that just sort of happened to be interested in the same thing. Now, at this point, the community was very, very small. The photography community was very, very small. And MFA in photography was virtually a brand new degree. So everybody kind of knew everybody. Everybody knew what was going on with each other's work, but they weren't really working cohesively. But they were all interested in how we were shaping our landscape, how we were building things up. Nicholas Nixon, very well-known photographer, his contribution to this show was photographs of Boston, of the city. You also get a lot of the photographers. There were 10 photographers that were exhibited in this show. 9 individuals, and then Bernd and Hille Becher, who are a very famous German photography couple, and they worked together. So this is Joe Deal. Joe Deal was also the manager of exhibitions at George Eastman during the new topographic show. He went to school here at UNM in Albuquerque and studied with Van Deren Koch, who was the curator of the time at the George Eastman House. So again, you start to see how there's this really very insular relationship. And the Bachelors were really sort of the odd people out here. They were the only ones who weren't American. They were German. Hille was the only woman, and they were the only duo. They worked together, and so this is very typical of their work. Pretty much everybody else was exhibiting 8x10, 8x12, small black and white prints, and they were using similar size prints, but then they would grid these prints together so that you would see these points of view of things like this coal breaker plant in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. This is also very typical of the work they made in Germany in the Ruhr River Valley, which was after World War II was starting to change dramatically, and they were basically documenting that. They also were, I would say, the most influential teachers in Germany at the Düsseldorf Kunstakademie, and you can still see their influence in a lot of the German photographers working today who studied underneath them. So that's my very brief summary of the history of photography, of landscape photography. When I started working on this project, one of the first things that kind of sprung me forward was this notion that with the new topographics, virtually everything is a negative look or has a negative feel to how we are shaping the land. They're not beautiful pictures. They were called styleless. I would not call them styleless. I would say that they're deadpan. It's a very deadpan look at the way we shape our world. And I was interested in thinking about how we try to shape our world in a positive way, which doesn't typically, has not been photographed a lot. And so I had been thinking for about 2-3 years at that point, since seeing those turbines, about how I could approach this. And the first response, when I started talking to people, the first thing that most people would talk about is visual blight, about how they found these machines ugly, a blight on the landscape. I personally disagree. I think they're very beautiful, elegant machines. That first view flying into Copenhagen, they kind of made me think of kinetic sculptures. I found them very beautiful. But I was thinking a lot about perspective and how we interact with these things visually, and how that really depends entirely on your perspective. So the fact that you could be in this beautiful park and you might see it, but it's just a tiny little blip. You got to look for it. It's right here. So this was the very first picture I made, and this sort of set off how I would approach this project. Now, like any long-term project, it starts to evolve and change through its own momentum as you move forward. There's a typo. That's Tehachapi Pass. So most people, it's starting to evolve a little bit, but most people in America still only experience these wind farms while they're zooming past on the freeway. They're not getting off the freeway and moving around underneath them. So they really see these sort of large-scale installations as they drive by. And so, I thinking a lot about people still sort of really having a negative opinion based on this experience about this lack of beauty or even this ugliness, but yet I never hear anybody complain about electrical substations, for example. Not very attractive, a blight on the landscape. Power lines. I mean, who's going to give up electricity because they don't want to see power lines? I've become very attuned, as you'll see in the next couple of photographs, to power lines in the landscape. And so I think I've gotten to a point, call me a little bit jaded. I don't necessarily think that photography is going to change the world. We have seen there have been some, terrifying photographs that we've seen. The droughts and the famines in Africa, for example, but yet we still haven't really changed the way we do business, the way we operate. So I'm not necessarily convinced that I'm going to bring all the hardcore anti-green energy people over to our side. But what I would really like people to do is sort of reconsider their notions of beauty, maybe, reconsider their notions about what's acceptable and what we need to do, how we need to affect our landscape in order to not kill the planet at maybe slow down the rate at which we're killing the planet. But yeah, so I think beauty, as any good artist, I think beauty is a way into this subject matter. For example, this is right off of Route 70 in Kansas. What you can't see immediately to the right of this picture is a boat that's just sitting there rotting in the landscape. So again, I would ask, what's so ugly about a wind turbine? So the new topographics has really affected how we view the landscape photographically, like I've said. It's really created a whole legion of photographers kind of working in this deadpan style. And while as you can tell, I very much appreciate this deadpan look, I also appreciate noticing beautiful things as well. And again, I would say, is a wind turbine any uglier than a pump jack, an oil pump jack, for example? And what happens when you look at them at sunset, right? Everything sort of becomes beautiful at that point. Yes? They are. So it's so that's all based on the shutter speed of the camera. And at this point, with the sun going down, you inherently sort of need to use a slower shutter speed. I always have the camera on a tripod. I always want to keep my ISO rating low because these prints, when I print these for exhibition, I print 2 sizes, and the largest is about this size, about 40 by 50 inches. So I need that resolution. So this is really just a side effect of the shutter speed, which I try to also vary as much as possible because I don't, when your subject is always kind of the same, where here I've stopped him a little bit more, I always kind of want to mix that up. Yes, yeah. Thank you. Yeah, the camera has a great way of sort of breaking down what our eye sees in a new way. This is the San Gorgonio Pass. If you've ever been to Palm Springs, you've driven through this massive field of turbines. At one point, this is the oldest wind farm in the country. Early 80s is when it began being developed. It's also one of the largest in the world in terms of the number of turbines, not the megawatts produced. Because most of these turbines are so old, this is actually a relatively low producing farm in terms of the energy. This is also really the first place, I think, that people did start to get a little bit more experience of sort of being directly under the turbines, unless they lived in a community where there were turbines, a rural community. Now we're starting to see a little bit more in the way of urban turbines. So this is the Great Lakes Science Center on Lake Erie in Cleveland, Ohio. And as you can tell probably by the marquee, the football team, the Cleveland Browns Stadium, is right behind me. So here is a place where people are really living underneath the turbines in America. This was also the first photograph I made last fall at the beginning of a 5,000-mile, 23-day road trip. I took this as a good omen. I rolled into town, it was raining. As soon as I set up got my camera out, the rainbow came out, and I said, okay, things are gonna go well. We can certainly talk about the noise, yeah. So like I mentioned, in America, most people are experiencing these from a freeway perspective. When we went back to Denmark, this was the first time that I really saw people living underneath the turbines, almost unaware that they were there. At the time that this photograph was made, these were the two tallest turbines in the world. They were experimental turbines. I don't believe that they are anymore. And this is a bike path here, big energy plant. So you can see, to the Danes, they've almost disappeared. They ride their bikes, they fish, they sail underneath these turbines, almost unaware of their existence. But at the same time, Denmark is on path to have 85% of their electricity produced by wind turbines. I think by 2035 is their goal. And they're actually a little bit ahead of their goal right now. This is Grevenbroich, Germany. This is a motocross track. So again, this was the first time I was really seeing people living their life underneath the turbines. You get pushed back anywhere. There are definitely people that are not fans of green energy in Germany, in Denmark, but by and large, it seems to be accepted a little bit in ways that it's not accepted here, even to the point that people are graffitiing on them. So this is all, the coastline is all public in Denmark. It's all open, so you can just walk right up underneath one of these things, which is not something that you can do very often in America. Now, this was my first experience really with people in America that were living under the turbines. And I kind of stumbled across this by accident. I was speeding down a country road in Wisconsin. Well, I was speeding down what I thought was a country road in Wisconsin. It turns out it was somebody's driveway. I almost hit him as I came over the hill. Regardless of that, he was very gracious and let me walk around his property to make photographs. The other interesting thing about this was that I learned from this photograph that people, the family farm is almost untenable in America now because of large corporate farming. And this community, people that were lucky enough to be situated so that they could have turbines placed on their land would get $5,000 a year in rent per turbine. So all of a sudden, some of these people were starting the year with $50,000 in income. That makes a family farm much more tenable nowadays. Some of the smaller communities, it's a little bit more common to sort of exist underneath of these. The rural communities outside of town. This is the Columbia River Gorge. This is about an hour outside of Brattleboro. At some point also, as I was mentioning the projects kind of pulling themselves ahead, I had always taken a very sort of straightforward, plain view in my approach. And there was, at some point, something clicked. I think it took a little longer than it should have, where I said, no, wait a second. There's some room to make more ethereal photographs, to approach this. I would say this is more of an emotional photograph than necessarily a descriptive one. But to think about how I'm representing these machines. This is a private lake in Roxbury, Maine. A lot of times, especially in America, because most of them are on private property, I really have to kind of drive around and try to find a point of view to make a good photograph from a public space. Occasionally I get lucky and I see people trying to back their boat into their garage, and I talk to them, and this gentleman and his wife let me wander around to make photographs in their yard. This is a campground in upstate New York. So we are now in America starting to have more places where people can really kind of be underneath these things and experience the noise, like you mentioned, or the view. This was a wedding. You can see here there's a woman on her cell phone. When I pulled up to this place, it's a massive hotel out in the White Mountains in New Hampshire. I went in to ask permission to walk around the grounds, and one of the clerks at the desk had mentioned that the bride, this tent here is set up for a wedding. They were having a massive wedding party, and the bride actually requested that they move the turbine before the ceremony. because she didn't want it to disturb her wedding. Here's another view of the Great Lakes Science Center. So at this point, it's starting to become a little bit more commonplace in dense populated areas. If anybody has been to Boston in the last couple of years, I think Boston is probably the place where you see them most in the cityscape. I have a friend, Greer Muldowney, who has done a project on wind energy specifically in Boston, and she's talking more about sort of land usage rights and who benefits. But Boston is a place where you see them in the middle of the city, and I think it's, again, is it any uglier than this coal-fired plant? This is in Gloucester. So some of the more fun things too are these weird little interactions of the built space that you get. This is a miniature church that's an exact replica of the church that it sits right next to. So we have these, again, thinking about how we build our space, we have these very idiosyncratic moments where we create things. This is a scale representation of Stonehenge that is a World War I memorial. So again, they didn't make a convincing connection for me in the placard. Nonetheless, I find it incredibly interesting. But we really do strange things in the world. We really build strange things. If any of you have been through Texas on I-40, this is Groom, Texas. This is the site, well, they claim they're the largest cross in the Western Hemisphere, but Google tells me that's not true. The largest cross, yeah. You can see it from miles away. East of Amarillo, exactly. This is Deer Island, so this is the water treatment facility for Boston. It's beautiful, they've made it into a park. I had to hike out a couple miles around to make this picture. It's a great walk until you get to the backside. And then as the wind blows across the sewage treatment plant, it's not quite so pleasant. This is really interesting. This is a town eaten by the Garzweiler strip mine in Germany. When I made this picture in 2016, I was driving around with a former student, the back roads of Nordrhein-Westfalen, and we stumbled upon this abandoned town, which we both thought it was a good idea to start walking around in. We weren't supposed to be there, but this is a strip mine that starts, so the motorcycle club picture that I showed you, just west of that town, this strip mine started. It's called Garzweiler because that's the original town that was seated there. And this is moving west to a town called Erkelenz. Now, what they're mining here is lignite, which is a low-energy peat coal, causes a lot of pollution. I find it rather ironic that this mine is surrounded by wind energy. But I think it's also an interesting conundrum because this mine will be 70 square miles when it's all said and done, but they're expecting the completion of the mining to happen in 2045. Now the problem is that Germany has a set goal of closing down all of their coal-fired power plants by 2035. So I think we're still in a situation here where the planning can be a little bit better and how we think about how we move into the future. Now some people just don't want to think about moving into the future. There are some people that you're never going to convince. In my 9 years of working on this, I've come across some protest signs, none quite as elegant, beautiful, and simple as this. I think this does the job. I was doing about 60 miles an hour when I passed this, and I slammed on the brakes. This has been the only one I could really get a good photograph of. But I think we do have to acknowledge that some people are just going to drag their feet, regardless of whether or not we can clearly present that there is obviously a problem with our energy system. I mean, I don't know that it's necessarily a question of improving or equality. I mean, I think, sure. Yes. Yeah, well, because I don't live in an area where they're ever going to put turbines right in, I understand that my opinion might carry a little less weight. I think what we've seen is that people are enticed into acceptance of these things through other programs. Tax abatements are a big thing. The revenue generated, like I mentioned, the wind industry pays out $1 billion a year, every year, to states, towns, municipalities, and private landowners. Now, if you're the guy that lives next door to the guy with the wind turbines, then yes, you might be a little more upset. Although, from what I understand from most of the people that I've talked to, there are some pretty substantial tax abatements that are given to the entire town. I talked to a woman in Vermont. Her and her husband had lived in the same house for 25 years. Turbines popped up about 5 years before, and I got the same thing from her that I get from everybody. Well, I really think we need to do it, but not in my backyard. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I agree. Yeah, I agree. I mean, and I think that that's where community-based decisions need to happen. But clearly, I may be wrong, and if any of you know differently, please tell me. To my knowledge, a wind farm has never bullied its way into a community without some modicum of support. Typically, there are community meetings. Okay. Right. Okay. 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 I'd actually like to talk to you about that afterwards just to get some information. Well, and one of the ways that I think communities try to alleviate these disputes are with things like this, these information kiosks. They show up in a lot of the major wind farms. They do sort of function as a form of propaganda, not the nefarious type of propaganda, but more in the purest sense of propaganda, of promoting the idea. But at this point, the decisions have been made, clearly, right? The wind farm is in existence. What I love about these, though, is they almost always work some aspect of turbine architecture into the design of the kiosk. Sometimes a little bit more gaudy. This is literally right behind Atlantic City. So as you drive into Atlantic City, you pass, there's about 5 turbines there. Sometimes they're a little bit more cost-effective, a little bit more simple. And sometimes they just use parts of it, and turbine blade and Sweetwater. But they have definitely become a part of the culture. So if you've ever been to the Cadillac Ranch in Texas, this is about 10 miles east of the Cadillac Ranch. This is just a turbine blade. Again, you can see this thing from miles away. Yeah, so this is a rest stop on I-80. So it's just, basically it's the community saying, hey, look what wind energy has done for us. Which I think to this point, this is another thing to think about, and I'll talk about it a little bit more in a minute, is what bringing a wind farm to the community can do for the community. So this is Weatherford, Oklahoma. The town itself is surrounded by turbines. This is actually a turbine blade over here. And this isn't a kiosk so much as a welcome to Weatherford sign, but you can clearly see how the community feels about wind energy. And I would say by and large, it's not negative. So this is the first town powered completely by wind energy. It's a very small town in Missouri. About 5 turbines power the entire town. So to counter this idea, the visual blight, the noise, this idea of corrupting these beautiful ridge lines with turbines, we also have to think about the positive things. So in 2018, there were 144,000 jobs created by the wind energy. $1 billion paid out. Jobs that can never be outsourced. You can't outsource turbine maintenance to India. It's going to be there. It's going to be in the community where these things exist. Again, typically rural communities that are really having a hard time and struggling right now. So 144,000 wind jobs as of 2018. It's about 6% of our electricity, or 26 million homes are powered by wind energy currently in the US, and about $1 billion a year paid out. If you've ever driven across 40, you've passed Tucumcari, and you've probably passed this turbine. So this is the Wind Research Center. It's part of the Mesa Lands Community College. So again, people that live in the community that maybe don't have a lot of opportunities are now able to secure a job that's stable and that pays very, very well.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
Going back to the town in Missouri, for example, what do they do for their backup storage? Are they essentially using the power grid as their backup storage? Because I think it's something that we need to discuss in the context of wind.
I agree.
And solar.
I agree, yeah, and I think that the biggest, so I can't speak specifically to what they do. All of this stuff is going into the existing grid. I think the missing link right now for all renewables is batteries. And hopefully Mr. Musk and Tesla is gonna advance us on that. I mean, that's one of the things they are doing a lot of R&D on is battery. How do we store this energy for later use? How do you reduce things like impedance, right? We know that if you move, the further you move energy through lines, the more energy you lose. So we need to, I mean, our grid is so out of date as it is anyways. I think that this is part of why we need a concerted effect to move forward. Part of the research, this is this U.S. Department of Energy Wind for Schools project. And right now there are 145 different systems in 12 states that the Department of Energy has put out as a way. This is not generating a ton of energy. This is more of a research and an educational tool. But I also think that it's really interesting to see, you know, when you think about an industrial scale wind turbine, and then you see something like this, which clearly is not putting off any sort of massive amounts of energy, but it does allow us to learn some things about how energy is produced, and it also introduces children and students to the idea. And along these lines, we have certainly had, I don't know if you could call it a boondoggle necessarily, but some turbines that are not really generating a whole lot of energy. You know, I always joke that maybe this powers the neon in the sign here, but it is a step forward. And then sometimes you get, this is one of my favorites, this is the greater Earthship community in Taos, across the gorge if you've ever been there. So this is an electricity producing wind turbine. It's also kind of a cool piece of art. So, you know, this is something that they made there and put up to do this. So I think that that's also shows a great spirit of innovation. And it kind of contrasts to these beasts, which most of us have seen. This is at Klein's Corners at 285 and 40. And I've never seen this thing turn. I don't know if it's functioned ever. I find it strangely beautiful, again, as a sculpture piece. But this has been a problem, the efficiency and the efficacy of these machines, but that is something that technology is starting to change. Excuse me. I've had a conversation, he's now retired, but he was an executive for Standard Oil and BP for many, many years. And his argument is always, the technology's just not there. Well, the technology's never going to be there unless we invest in it. Probably every one of you have a smartphone in your pocket right now. That smartphone has more computing power than we used to put people on the moon and to bring them home. It's because it's evolved. So and we can see this if you ever drive through Palm Springs. You can see an evolution of wind energy. There are literally dozens of generations of machines in that one place. So now this is called a vertical axis turbine, right? Because the blade axis is vertical instead of horizontal. So these were not typically effective. So they were able to capture the wind from all directions, but what they lost was the efficacy, the ability to actually generate much energy. Now that has started to evolve. This is a company outside of Pittsburgh called Windstacks. If you can't see it, this is the wind turbine there. That wind turbine powers all the electricity to the, I think it's 26,000 square foot building right next to it. There's a 5-story building right next to it, and that provides the electricity for it. So the technology certainly is evolving. So in the last 10 years, I've driven about 25,000 miles in the US, 31 states, and I've photographed in Sweden, Denmark, and Germany, and I will be returning later this fall or early next spring to Europe to wrap up the project in the Netherlands, Belgium, France, Portugal, and Spain. And then at that point, I will begin to look for a publisher. This will ultimately end up as a book format. So that's what I've got for you.
I'm sorry? Yeah, can we use the microphones, please? Hold on.
Yes, if everyone could just let me pass around the microphone, and please put your questions into the microphone because we are streaming this live, so that folks that are streaming it and watching this on their computers can hear. Thank you.
Yeah, you know, the windmills that have been around for centuries in Europe, that, like I was wondering how are you planning to fit those into the aesthetics scheme that you're talking about?
No, at this point, I've really focused specifically on energy-producing turbines. So the turbines that are pulling water out of the ground for animals or for milling, I'm not really interested in those. It's specifically electricity-producing turbines.
You've been talking about the objections to the aesthetics, and so for centuries, nobody's objected to those aesthetics. That was my what I was wondering.
And that's a very good point. I think that I believe that that's probably because we tend to romanticize things from the past. So people view those much more romantically than they do a field of turbines that looks like this.
What I'd like to do before we discuss this further is to clean up a myth that I've heard you generate, which is that people that are against placement of what reason ever, which we don't, or I don't want to get into right now because there's multiples. So the folks that are against placement of these wind turbines that are in Germany in excess of the heights of the Cologne Cathedral, for example, that these people are actually against green power, because that is not so. I would like to really emphasize that that is, to a certain point, complete bogus. The people in Germany, for example, they are very, very much interested in alternative energy production.
Agreed.
But to place wind turbines in areas that have not even enough wind to make this thing 70%, carrying the product. So what I'm saying is that there is a lot of people that are standing up, especially in Europe, because Europe is not like the United States, where there's vast, areas like this in your picture, where you basically have a wind turbine the size of the Cologne Cathedral in your backyard that does the hum for the next foreseeable time, which is, for a lot of people, a total health negative.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I have seen very little. I've seen very little resistance in Europe to the idea, and most of it is as you say, it has more to do with the environment. Now, I will challenge you on the hum. There have been several studies. There is a pediatrician in Vermont that has been putting forth this idea of wind turbine illness. And so far, from what I've seen, I'm not a scientist, but from what I've seen, the empirical science community has strongly rejected her ideas. It's all rooted in the frequency of the noise. They do make noise, they are loud, but from what I have seen, there are no actual health. This idea of wind turbine syndrome, it's a psychosomatic illness. They're annoyed, and I get it. I mean, again, this is the stuff I'm reading. I'm not a pediatrician, I'm not a doctor, I'm not an engineer. I only know what I've read, but I've seen that the illnesses have been strongly rebutted, and it certainly doesn't cause cancer, as Mr. President has suggested.
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
You have presented this in a very black and white way. If somebody is against a wind turbine, you're calling that regressive in effect. And I think most people support green energy, but as this gentleman said, object to sometimes where they're placed. A lot of times they're placed, wind turbines have to be up relatively high in order to work. So you get a mountaintop that all of a sudden has a lot of turbines on it. And I, for one, don't consider that an aesthetically positive change. We have those issues, whether wind turbines or drilling. Near Chaco here, it's up in Bears Ears, Escalante. I mean, there's all kinds of issues going on with that. So I think your presentation is unfortunate in that respect. I also wanted to, you've also talked about the decisions of communities, and what you've really talked about is the monetization of wind turbines, that people put them in their fields because they get $5,000. They put them other places because the community benefits from either jobs or rent or whatever. And that's not the same thing as enjoying the aesthetic of a place. And finally, you mentioned that there were 144,000 jobs created. Those are in manufacturing plants. The maintenance people out in the rural areas who maintain these are one or two people. They do absolutely nothing for the economy of that area.
Okay. I don't have a breakdown personally of where those jobs are distributed throughout the industry. And it is information from the wind energy lobby, so certainly they have a bias. I'm sorry that you took that as such a black and white presentation. Like I mentioned, I don't live underneath these things, so I am basically somebody who's buzzing through town making photographs. I do think, though, that monetization is a way that we have to look at the subject matter in terms of creating jobs, in terms of helping rural communities that are suffering. Rural communities are suffering, by and large, at higher percentages than urban communities are right now for jobs, healthcare, etc. I also agree with you. I mean, I understand why people don't necessarily aesthetically like them. And I do think, and I hope that it is a community decision when it comes down to placing things in. But like in a democracy, it's going to be a majority decision. And so hopefully it's not a big industry coming through and steamrolling everybody. And I'm sure that there are examples. I know that there are examples of wind farms that have been sort of pushed on a community when it's not really the ideal place in terms of the amount of wind in the area. Or there you have a place like Kansas, which is only capturing about, the last time I checked, about 40% of their potential.
So your monetization argument would basically say that you would support oil and gas developments around Chaco and drilling in the Escalante. Well, that's what you just said. You said the
That's
monetization.
not what I said.
Yeah, it is. You said the monetization is the most important thing, rather than the aesthetics of an area or the cultural importance of an area.
I think you're interpreting me a little bit, and supporting wind energy and supporting drilling in Bears Ears is not the same thing. I wouldn't. I think the whole point of wind energy is to reduce the need for fossil fuels. along with solar energy, which obviously is huge out here. If the wave technology can get to a point where we can generate more energy from there. I'm not talking about just putting these things up everywhere, so.
Besides, who's filing for drilling permits over there where he's talking about anyway?
I'm not sure. You'd have to ask the gentleman. I do recall that President Trump was trying to, and his former.
Who's actually wanting to drill there?
You'd have to ask the gentleman.
It's right here. Yeah. I have a home on the east coast of Delaware. And the issue there is, of course, there's a lot of farmland in Delaware as well as Maryland. So the issue is putting, the option is, of course, to put them on the land. The other option is to, the proposal is to put 200 off the coast, which sounds pretty simple, and it doesn't interrupt the landscape, and it's quite a ways out, so it would barely be noticeable. The issue on water seems to be you have three types of traffic competing. You have commercial, you have military, and you have entertainment. So where do you place these that would not interrupt the flow of traffic on the ocean versus balancing, we don't want them on land, but you have all this open waterway.
Yeah, I would say that would be up to the maritime authorities to determine that. I think one of the larger issues is that it is considerably more costly to put them in water. You have to pour concrete pylons down to the ocean floor. You have to, ship everything out. You have to put cables to run the energy back. And in smaller countries, Denmark, for example, obviously they don't have the land mass that we have. We have a lot more land mass in the U.S., as the gentleman from Germany mentioned. I don't know if you mentioned that here when we were talking before. In terms of the boat traffic, though, I mean, the Baltic Sea is a major shipping lane, and it's packed with them. So I think that they have managed to negotiate that somehow.
Could I take the floor and have a question? This has been really interesting. One of the aesthetic questions that we haven't addressed is the aesthetics of global warming. One of the offsetting aesthetic questions might be, hey, how do we feel about losing snow-covered peaks and glaciers and so forth? And does this technology give us an aesthetic boost in terms of lowering our carbon dioxide use? I have a different question, though. One of the books that has taken social science by storm in the last decade is a book called Carbon Democracy by a political scientist named Timothy Mitchell, who's already well known for his work in urban Egypt, in the way that the landscapes of Egypt were transformed by colonization. In any case, Professor Mitchell argues in this book, Carbon Democracy, that the forms, this is a sociological picture, and you'll have to use your sociological imaginations for a moment to get at this. He argues that in the late 19th, early 20th century, the principal form of energy that the world used was coal, and that because of the nature of the mining process, because coal is mined and it's a skilled trade, that coal miners were able to unionize and clamp down on a sort of a choke point in the mines to demand more democracy, and in essence to demand better working conditions, shortened work week, all kinds of benefits that came out of those union struggles, popular benefits. But the second part of his argument is that then as the world shifted to oil as a form of carbon energy production, the ability to sort of make that kind of choke point stick was lost, because the work is done on the surface. If a group of oil workers unionize to try to demand better whatever conditions, they can simply be replaced. They're not a skilled labor force. My grandfather was a coal miner, and he was a strong union man, so this resonated with me. The question, and this is speculative, what your presentation makes me think about is, what would this type of energy regime imply for, the future of sort of energy politics? Do you have any ideas about that? I know it's a big speculative question, but I thought that would be fun to think about.
Energy politics, wow. Well, I feel like a large driving force of our politics is energy and energy policy. I'm sorry, and what? And cheap energy. Yes, affordable energy. So I feel like this is already sort of inherently part of this, and clearly, specifically wind energy, renewable energy as a whole, but specifically wind energy is sort of a focal point for political anger and conflict. I mean, I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that even though 96% of climate scientists agree that we are creating problems in the world, man-made problems, it's important to say that, we still have people that are diametrically opposed to any shift. We still have people that just simply deny that this is a problem. And I think that's the political problem here, is how can we all come together in agreement on this so that we can start thinking about pragmatic ways to move forward. Wind energy may not be the most pragmatic way when it comes down to it. We may find that there are better solutions than wind energy, but I will say this, wind energy technology has so dramatically improved in the last 30 years, and production, the ability to produce more from less, that I think that we need to continue to work on this infrastructure until we find something better. You know, solar is great out here, but I'm from the Midwest, and it's gray most of the time, so solar energy is not going to do a whole lot for people in Columbus, Ohio, for example.
So I had a great opportunity. I'm right here.
Sorry.
Yeah. My name's Liesl Dennis, local photographer, author. My husband, Lant Dennis. Been around Santa Fe since 1980. I just had to me, fantastic opportunity in Houston at the end of May to go to the AWEA conference, the American Wind Energy Association convention, the biggest wind energy conventions thus far in the industry. FYI, the next one will be in June in Denver. And so anyone who is interested in a depth study of the latest of what is going on in the wind energy department, just drive up to Denver. You can find IWEA. It's a website, easy enough to find on Google. But there were a couple things that I learned that I thought were very, very interesting, and I'll just touch on two of them. With respect to what I call wind whir, or the hum issue that many, many people have, there is a Danish company that has designed and is manufacturing what they referred to as spoilers. Different designs. I can describe one of them, which I think is the easiest to describe visually. It's like a saw, and it is feathered into the tip ends of the blades. And what this particular, it's not an add-on, it's not an aftermarket thing. It was in the beginning, but now this particular, I'm just going to call it a saw or a feather, is now being manufactured directly into the blades. So, and then there is another, design of spoiler, which looks more like the back of your Porsche. So anyway, that was for me to see and hear and meet people across the board of what's going on in the wind energy world. And there were people from Germany and Denmark and Holland, as you might, Belgium and whatever, as you might well suspect. But I think the key thing that I learned was how fast wind energy technology and wind capture is developing.
Absolutely.
Has developed faster in the last 3 years than in the entire, whatever, let's say 30 years as a benchmark looking backwards. And there is so much creative and social energy going into the development of the wind turbine. Yes, the naysayers, absolutely. We just all saw the walkout in Montana, the political guys or gals who didn't want to stand up to the conversation. So the political anger around the element that I happen to find beautiful, and in fact have done a book on the history of windmills and wind turbines that goes back to 1976. And then the other thing that I learned as a practical economic note is that these tax abatements or whatever, they are going to disappear in about a year and a half. And so, in these breakout sessions that were absolutely fantastic in Houston, there isn't anything that you can't learn about what's going on right now in this industry. And the people who are involved in putting it forward, promoting, developing the technologies, they are really in a hurry because of the exigency of the climate change, climate catastrophe, whatever term you want to give it, global warming, but they are also racing against time economically, because when we talk about, and I have personal friends here in Santa Fe who are putting these wonderful turbines up, in southern New Mexico, for economic reasons. They're not quite retired, but they see more economic opportunity by having a few of these things down south than the jobs they're currently doing here in Santa Fe. And I met other farmers and ranchers and just, amazing people to be met. But there is a race against not just the existential human clock, but the economics of maintaining the lower price point of wind-generated energy.
Yeah, I agree. And to your point of the technology development, I think that I keep coming back to Palm Springs. I think this is a great sort of representation of this idea. Palm Springs at one point had close to 5,000 turbines. I think they're around 3,200 to 3,500 right now. Those turbines are producing less than a new field of turbines with, say, 200 to 300 turbines. So that is how, and so that Palm Springs started being developed in the early 80s and has, continued into the 90s, and then they started to turn over some of the turbine models, replace them with new technology. But I think that is a testament to the development of the technology. And you're right, the last 3 to 5 years, it's skyrocketed. AWEA is great. AWEA is the American Wind Energy Association. They are the lobby. They are a wind energy lobby, which typically I kind of regard as a nefarious thing. But they seem a little less nefarious than some other people, some other lobbies, in my opinion.
Yeah, in terms of it being a lobby, AWEA, for sure. But as an information, if you want to really learn what's going on, don't worry about it being a lobby, because it doesn't present that way. It's about information, it's about education, and just a hell of a good time meeting, especially at the Hilton Hotel bar after.
They know how to party.
Yeah,
I have a-
so, you know, the wind energy bar scene is really fun as well.
We have a question here.
And if I could just address your second point to the economics, this gentleman, I think, thinks that economics is on the top of my mind. It's not. Climate, to me, is the most important thing. Climate change. Yes, I have drank the Kool-Aid. I believe that we are screwing up the planet. And if you disagree with me, that's your prerogative. But we can be civil and disagree. I think that climate change is the #1 factor here. But you can't not consider the economics. And if a guy can save his family farm that has been in his family for generations with a couple of turbines, and now he can leave this farm to his children, I think that's a great thing. I mean, in fact, we do. This used to be a country of family farms, and it just simply is not. ConAgra owns everything now.
Here, we have a question here. She's been waiting for a while.
I think what I'd like to say is I'd like to broaden this discussion, if I may.
Please.
I think transmission lines, I've never liked transmission lines. From the time let's say a few years ago, I was in Phoenix and out by Taliesin, and you just about can't photograph Taliesin without getting transmission lines. So I don't have any great love for them, even though I understand why they're there. I think on the question of, and there are the problems of transmission lines.
Sir.
Distance transmission doesn't really make sense for wind, even though I know that people put their wind farms, their turbines in their fields, and then hope that the electric company and the rest of us will pay $1 million a mile, because that's what it costs to build a transmission line.
Well, the wind companies are responsible for putting all this stuff in.
Right, but either way, I mean, this dynamic doesn't always fit. Secondly, on community input, I always think that community input tends to be a little bit in favor of organized community input, and when people step forward and say other things, they tend to get disregarded. I think this is a very serious problem in our community as a whole, regardless of the issue. And so, you know, even with the factor of, is there some illness possibly in the underbelly of wind turbines? Maybe it's there. But with the short time frames that we allow for that discussion and for that research, we don't always get the answers. And I think the fact that we don't alert ourselves to the reality that there are longer time horizons that are relevant, that's very important too in a discussion like this. The last thing I want to talk about is the cost of harvest. Just because wind is free, so sun is free, the cost of harvesting is something else. And the impact of that cost of harvesting, especially in a state like New Mexico, where a great deal of our tax revenue depends upon the fact that we are getting our money out of the oil and gas fields, and we are not looking at how the harvesting of renewables must in some way, I believe, replace a piece of that tax revenue. I don't care how we do it, whether we put it on the property tax, whether we put it where, but we need to begin to examine these greater issues. And I'm hoping that when you put your book out, you might find opportunity to do that, because I think the discussion will be much richer. And the last thing I'd like to say is I want to put in a plug. Here in New Mexico, our utilities are required to gather public input once every 3 years through integrated resource projection program that goes for 20 years. The one for PNM will be starting up in the next week that will produce a report a year from now. I really urge people to sit there in those meetings, because I've been doing it now. This will be my 4th one starting next week, and they've only had 5. It's like the Wind Energy Association. There's a lot of information that you learn going into that lion's den, whose ever lion's den it is. And you know, you find out where the claws are. You also find out where the weaknesses are. you also find out things like, I'd have never known that wind energy costs, the transmission lines cost $1 million a mile. And those are the kind of things that help us all really get better at understanding where we want to be.
I agree, and I could not agree more with this notion of dialogue in the community. I think that that's incredibly important. I think that that's something, if you look at our Congress, we've frankly lost the ability to have a true critical thought process, a true dialogue around ideas. Unfortunately, it's the money or it's the loudest voice in the room that wins out, and I think that's really unfortunate. And certainly, the business comes into these small towns, and maybe they make promises, maybe they push a little harder. I think it is very important to have everybody's voice. I think it is very important to be a democratic process. So I could not agree with you more. To the idea of the money, I mean, at this point, like I mentioned, they're paying out $1 billion a year to municipalities, landowners, and whatnot, where the flip side of this is when a Walmart comes into town, they get a tax break. For example, I mean, a Walmart obviously is not an energy company, but so I think the way that large corporations do business can be very problematic. You know, maybe some of the wind companies are engaging in that as well. I would have to see specifics, you know, to a specific case, but I definitely agree with you about the dialogue that needs to happen.
This is 3 years ago, I was driving through the northern part of Texas, and suddenly, like you say, there's these vast open landscapes, and now there's the windmills everywhere. And I pulled off the interstate to listen to them. Has anybody ever done that? Ever actually pulled off to listen to them? They make a sound that's just kind of whoosh, whoosh. I mean, they're not just making this horrendous racket. Now, obviously, if you're living right underneath it, that would be somewhat annoying. But it's not this big racket. So that's number.
It's less than the freeway that you exited.
No kidding. Than one 18-wheeler blasting down that highway. Well, it's a whole lot more than a cornfield.
Sure, substantially more than a cornfield. Agreed.
What about the crows?
It's not more than the ocean.
Or the trains, or the airplanes, or
whatever. Then here I've got about a couple of other observations. I've always wondered, and again, this picture would be a great example of it. Why are they not painted a light blue, so they just kind of, you know, blend into the landscape?
You know, birds have to see them.
Yeah, my guess is it has some effect of low-flying aircraft, birds, yeah.
Then there was, again, to your all's points, there was a story, gosh, this was 2 years ago, in the New Mexican. It was about a Hispanic family way up in northeastern New Mexico, and this was their, you know, generations old farm, and it was just dirt, and it was like about 1 year out of 6 they ever made money on it until they, not when I say made money, made enough to live off of, until they put windmills on it. And then here was maybe you know the answer. Where are these transmission lines from these things? How are they transmitting the energy? Look at them. I mean, there's nothing there.
It's underground.
Well, okay, I looked. All right, I was there underneath this giant windmill. You couldn't even see the trenching underground. And I'm going to tell you, they either did a great job on trenching. I mean, you just couldn't see it.
So most of these modern machines, they have a transformer built into, so typically just it'll be inside the base, inside the door. And then they all run to a central hub, and you'll find at least one transformer station nearby. They all run to that transformer station. They're all connected from a central point. They can turn the nacelles to face the wind. They can turn them on or off. If there's not enough wind, they don't run them. If there's too much wind, they don't run them if the speeds are too high, depending on the models of turbine. But yeah, it's all buried underground, you know, which would be an ideal for all of our power lines. But obviously, as she mentioned, it's not always cost effective to bury these lines. It's very expensive.
I'm a political scientist, and I was kind of interested in the way you approached politics and aesthetics. And I think you set yourself up in some respects for all these arguments you're getting in that what you want to talk about is the aesthetics. Mm-hmm. And you want to, people have been talking about the argument in terms of political dimensions. And I think the more you can shape an aesthetic argument, and I particularly like the idea of the contrast of what else you see out in the rural areas that's just disgusting in many respects. Then it come in maybe to some of the pollution stuff. But I think your eye for the aesthetics, it can be pushed a lot further. I mean, I liked what you pushed in the sense that I hadn't thought of it that way. Mm-hmm. But I think with your keen eye, the more you can do that, the more you can develop an argument with it. I don't know, it's just a cast off.
Yeah, well, I appreciate your comment. I will say this, I think I went over what they really wanted me, how long they wanted me to speak by about 12 minutes. I think I showed you 52 of my images, 52 out of like 300. So there's a bit of an editing process there. And I have also been very limited by access. So in Europe, it is much easier to photograph, well, that's okay. In America, the problem is that the vast majority of these are on private land, and the wind energy companies, because of the political nature of the argument, generally aren't really enthusiastic about helping, including AWEA. AWEA has had my work on their website, on their blog. They heavily edited my statement for political reasons. And they really want to focus on a different kind of picture. When I was talking to them and trying to get some access to some of these places, then it sort of turned into a little bit of an extortion situation where they were like, well, we can get you access, but you need to give us X number of images per location, unlimited rights in perpetuity. So essentially I was going to pay for their advertising. So that didn't work out. In Europe, like I mentioned, it's a little bit easier because most of these places are either on public land, or if they're on private land, there's a bike path riding right through the middle of the field. I mean, Germany, I actually, a lot of the photos I made in Germany, I made on a bicycle with 50 pounds of gear on my back, bicycling through the fields. So that, to your point, my aesthetics are limited somewhat by my access, and somewhat by a limited amount of time here. Now, I did have the opportunity to go up on a turbine in Germany, in the town of Aachen. They have there's a little wind farm that's on the border of Germany and the Netherlands, and they have a wind turbine that has a viewing tower below it. So you can actually, and normally they won't let you carry stuff up, but I had been talking to the guy for a couple weeks, and they let me carry my cameras and my tripod up and everything to make some photos. I had been trying to get on top of one of these turbines for 3 years, and nobody had any interest. I told them I'd sign whatever. My wife wasn't going to sue them if I fell off the top of one of these turbines. But it's very restrictive. So I've sort of had to approach this from an outsider's perspective. Now, on Instagram, there's a wonderful page called Tower Climbing Monkeys, and it's turbine technicians. And they make these, they're not photographers, but they make some pretty great photos from the tops of these turbines. So I agree. I think that I could sculpt this argument visually in a very, very strong way if I had unfettered access.
Yeah, and in that sense, what I'm trying to say, you don't need to answer these guys. Your job, you're not an economist.
No.
And you're not a community organizer or anything like that. So don't get into that.
I appreciate that, but I think to the point
they're going to kill you.
Yeah,
You're an artist. You don't,
I appreciate that, but to this woman's point, I think that dialogue is crucial. I think that if people, you know, and I am a quote unquote documentarian, right? So objectivity doesn't really truly exist, but I you know, like with the protest sign, I try to show both sides of this, and I think that it is important to have a dialogue, and I would never want to shut down somebody who disagrees with me just because they disagree with me. I don't think that we get anywhere from that.
And there's a difference between shutting them down and whether you want to argue with them on this.
Fair enough.
Your talent is. The other thing that was interesting to me politically on this is you are just as political as the old landscape artists that were making us so depressed.
Yes.
Right,
I think that it's
you're-
hard not to be, if you're an engaged human, an engaged citizen, and you're engaged with what your country, your government is doing, what your community is doing, then I think we're a political animal. We're a communal animal, and by that communal nature, we need to be political.
You can tell them you're political.
I'm sorry that we have to end the formal questions. Perhaps we can stay
Sure.
here and talk some more, Brian, if you're
Absolutely.
willing. Please join me in thanking Bryan.
Thank you, everyone.
Please, if you have more questions, I saw there were a lot more hands up. Come on up. We will.
Thank you,
take
Paul,
some
and
time.
everybody at SAR for bringing me out.